everybody. This is ATTY Frekhtman, a New York City personal injury trial attorney. And today we're talking about PTSD. Is post-traumatic stress disorder as valuable as a brain injury, as a traumatic brain injury in terms of the law? And in order to answer that question, we really have to dive into the medicine. We have to ask ourselves, is PTSD a TBI? Is post-traumatic stress disorder a traumatic brain injury? So we can go into the medicine a little bit. Then we can look at the symptoms of PTSD, how to diagnose it, the criteria. And then perhaps we could look at how a lawyer should develop a case by speaking with family members, by understanding the symptoms, and then go from there and do a little bit of a deep dive into PTSD. Okay, so let's get started. So yeah, according to the medical literature, PTSD is a brain injury. Medical professionals now agree. If it's significant and it goes untreated, it will change the chemistry in the brain. Certain levels of certain proteins will be changed, and it will alter someone's brain anatomy in a number of areas critical to cognitive functioning. So basically, in terms of diagnosing PTSD, it's really important to see a medical professional because you cannot self-diagnose. It's kind of like if somebody is, at a bar and they're drinking and then they say, give me the keys, I'm going to drive home. They're not in any position to determine whether or not it's safe to drive because they've been drinking, right? It's the same thing with PTSD. And some people even think that PTSD, this fear, the stress that you have because of a traumatic event, is similar to a fear of snakes or a fear of spiders or a fear of heights, in the sense that it becomes part of your DNA. There's a whole field known as epigenetics, and it could become part of your DNA that it was a traumatic experience that maybe happened to one of your ancestors, and now it's part of your DNA so that you could survive your physical environment and you could pass it on to your progeny. And so there's even a theory about that. But with respect to, in respect to this area, it's really like there was a book known as The Body Keeps the Score, that your body doesn't want you to experience this type of trauma, this type of stress again. So it's like a coping mechanism, and that is similar to PTSD. Like, for example, when some people see a spider or a snake, or they have a physical reaction, they can't breathe, they get tight, they start hyperventilating. So it just depends on the person. And it's the same thing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so there is objective testing for PTSD. And some of this includes things like a SPECT scan, a 3T MRI, and they could look at the focal atrophy of the brain, the hard wiring, and they could look at the synapse formation, and they see like the focal atrophy, the gray matter, the brain actually loses water and it gets smaller. And you could do testing like a diffuse tensor imaging testing on PTSD, and it's objective because you could see the anatomical, the structural, and the functional damage to the brain on the neuroradiological images. And so with TBI, some practitioners say, it's good to wait. It's good to wait at least 6 months after the car crash or after the traumatic event. And does that apply to PTSD? I would say no. And the reason is because with a TBI, the reason you wait 6 months or longer to do like a 3T MRI or a DTI is because of neuroplasticity. The brain can rewire itself to avoid the trauma and to fix itself, right? So you give it a chance to heal. But with PTSD, it cannot be cured. The synapses and the wires form the connection through the fear. And once they are already formed, the only way to later fix it is a type of therapy to try to retrain the brain, but it's not the same. You don't have neuroplasticity with PTSD. So it is a real injury, and I would say it is as valuable as a TBI. And the PTSD affects the medial, the dorsolateral, the prefrontal cortex, all parts of the brain, the four major parts. And it is an actual bodily injury because the SPECT images show PTSD as an actual physical bodily injury, and they show the neurobiological changes, the chemical changes to the central and the autonomic central nervous system, the changes in the brain which control your body. So then really it changes the entire body, because first it changes the brain, but then the brain is what controls your body, so it changes your entire body, right? It changes everything. And there are certain criteria known as the DSM-5. They're diagnostic criteria to try to determine whether or not a physical disorder is PTSD. So it's no longer considered a mood disorder. It's known as a trauma and stressor-related disorder in which chemical alterations in the brain cause severe structural and functional damage. And therefore, it is a bioneuropathophysiological injury. And the diagnosis is extremely complex. There's three different criteria. Criteria A, there has to be a prerequisite, right? An external stressor, which is a traumatic event. And basically, a traumatic event could be a direct personal exposure to trauma, such as getting into a horrible car crash. It could be witnessing a trauma. It could be learning that a relative or a close friend was exposed to a trauma, or it could be indirect exposure to aversive details, usually through someone's like professional duties, maybe like a nurse, and she sees something that's just horrific, you know? So the criteria B is known as intrusion, and that's a persistent re-experiencing of the traumatic event in at least one way. And that means that they relive the event, they re-experience the trauma, either through unwanted memories, through nightmares, through flashbacks, through emotional distress after exposure to a reminder of the traumatic event, or through physical reactivity after exposure to a reminder of the traumatic event. And by reminder of a traumatic event, that's really known as a trigger. So then criteria C is known as avoidance. And with avoidance, it's avoidance of stimuli related to the traumatic event in at least one way. And it could be internal, such as avoiding the traumatic event. You don't want to think about it, you don't want to feel it. Or it could be external. You avoid the traumatic event and anything related to it, anything that could be a reminder of it, you just want to avoid. So that could be external. And then, you know, it's really important also to consider the brain structure and then the regions of the brain. So it's almost like you have 1, 2, and 3, right? Kind of like levels of a house, like the first floor, the second floor, and the third floor. Let's start with the top level, the third floor. There you have what's known as the executive function, right? The cerebrum. It's the cerebral cortex and the neocortex. And what that does is it controls visual processing. It controls voluntary movement, orientation, calculation, and recognition. It controls your sound, speech comprehension. It has all of the integrated memory functions and integrated brain functions of thinking, conceptualizing, planning, functions and abilities that are unique to human beings, right? Such as language, problem solving. So that's very, very important. That's known as executive functions. Then downstairs on the second level, you have the limbic system, and that might be feeding information upwards to the cortex. The limbic system is more comprised of the amygdala, right? The hypothalamus and the hippocampus. And you're unaware of it. It's unconscious, but it affects your experiences because it feeds information up to the executive function, to the cortex on the third floor, right? And so it directs information to other areas of the brain for processing, and it generates our emotions. It directs our behavior in ways that protect our survival. It coordinates and refines movement. So it helps the body to constantly adjust to the environment. And it's very important as it lays down long-term memory And that's where fear is registered and generated, right? That's where fear comes from, is like the amygdala and the limbic system. And then on the first floor, even lower, you have the brain stem. And that basically is the endpoint of nerves housed in the spinal cord. And it forms the meeting point between the central nervous system and the brain itself. So basically, that's like known as the reptile brain, all the way in the bottom, the stem. And that's what actually sends the signals down the spinal cord for movement. And what that does, it's on the receiving end of direct, instantaneous communications from the amygdala, and it bypasses the cortex, the executive function on the third floor. It just bypasses it, right? It governs our level of alertness. It controls the body's most essential processes, such as our heartbeat, our blood pressure, our respiration, the airways, our respiratory capacity, how much we can breathe, our digestion, our blood flow, like determining where the blood should flow, which organs need the blood. So that's all done by the brain stem. And it's important because the limbic system, that's what governs the post-traumatic processes in the brain. And so that's very important. Now, going to that downstairs, the limbic system, you have the amygdala. And what the amygdala does is it remembers and re-experiences fear and terror. And it also serves as the body's, or actually the brain's detective, right? Because what it does is it's responsible for investigating and the unfamiliar or ambiguous signs of danger. So the amygdala is physically connected to the hippocampus. And what the hippocampus does is they work as a team. So the hippocampus records and stores previous situations factually, while the amygdala records and provides emotional context, such as the emotional significance of past events, especially those that prove to be dangerous. So it really controls danger. And some people even refer to the amygdala as the nose brain, because what it does is it's like an electrical plug, right? It's just plugged in. So if you smell danger, if anything gives you danger, like a smell, it's just like it takes one synapse, like one cell, and it's a millisecond and you feel it right away. It doesn't have to travel anywhere. It definitely doesn't have to travel up to the long executive function thinking part of the brain, the cerebrum. It stays in that area and it's instantaneous. That's why some people in language, they talk about smelling danger or sniffing out danger. Our sense of smell often alerts us to the body, alerts our body to danger before the other senses. So it's important because the amygdala serves as a type of special memory bank, and much of our incoming information is stored even for several years in the hippocampus, but it eventually gets sent up to the cortex for long-term archiving and storage. But memories of fear and terror are an exception. They never go up to the executive function, to the cortex, to the cerebrum. What they do is they are always retained in the amygdala, which is a tiny, portion of the brain. It's in the temporal lobe, and it's tiny. It's like an almond. There's I believe two of them. There's two little almonds. And all our fears, all our terrors get stored there. And they're always retained in the amygdala, and thereby it provides the fastest retrieval time when threats arise. So it's like an electrical plug, and it's just one cell, one neural synapse. And that's why some people say, like, when the amygdala gets triggered, it's very easy to sense anger, right? People get angry really easily because of that amygdala. So then talking about downstairs, again, the limbic system, that's the second floor. You also have the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is like the hard drive memory of a computer, but in your brain. But it's different because it's actually unlimited. And what it does is it brings together all the data from all the different senses, and it shares them with the amygdala as a global comprehensive presentation, almost like a multi-sensory screenshot. So it's simultaneous, right? It could be a smell, a taste, a touch, and it's multi-sensory, and boom, and it stores all of that. So the amygdala completes the picture of danger by supplying the added emotional context related to the fear of terror. And the hippocampus also works to constantly map our life and our environment. It's almost like a GPS system for the brain. And people do manufacture new neurons, and those are usually birthed in the hippocampus. But if the hippocampus comes under attack, then those brain cells get destroyed, and then the brain's ability to replenish itself, known as neuroplasticity, becomes also diminished or destroyed. But it's interesting because every sensory input of every variety can be received at the same time in the hippocampus. And then downstairs in the limbic system, also you have the hypothalamus, and that's almost like the director. And there's something known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPA. And what that does is it's a connective response system which regulates hormones secreted by both the anterior pituitary gland and the adrenal gland in response to stress and threats. So I think the important thing to learn from this is that it's all kind of like unconscious, right? It's almost like these lower levels, like the reptilian brain, the brainstem, as well as the limbic system, are almost like unconscious. You're unaware of it. These are things that regulate like your blood flow, your heart rate, your digestion, and then they are the ones that store the fear and respond to the fear. So when they start responding to fear, responding to terror, that's where the PTSD can come in. So basically what it does, the hypothalamus, is it regulates the autonomic nervous system, and it reacts to save the body from the threat automatically without having to exert conscious control. And that includes heart rate, blood pressure, water levels in the body, temperature, hormonal activity, biological drives, especially our survival-driven behaviors, right? You want to survive. When you have something like, somebody comes at you with a gun, or you have some kind of danger, you're not going to start thinking, well, what should I do? What's the best thing to do? Let's map this out. You just have to, boom, you have to react right away. Otherwise, you're going to be dead. So that's why through many, many evolutions, through our DNA, through our ancestry, through everything, our genetics, that's how we are designed, right? We have this system. It's also, some people call it fight or flight. And then the final one is like the brain stem, which I think we talked about, the brain stem. So then the survival responses, basically you have to survive in the face of serious threats, and the amygdala and the hippocampus provide instant analysis of situations, and they send messages to the hypothalamus, which regulates and prescribes the right balance of hormones and neurotransmitters needed to activate the body's physical response, right? And the brainstem just carries out the orders. And the problems arise when this life-saving system can't switch into stand-down mode. And that's where PTSD comes in, right? Because the amygdala senses that the body has tripped across something, anything, that even partially resembles an old trauma, and then there's an error, and it errs on the side of caution, and it swings the entire system into action again and again and again, even though there's no more danger, right? The danger might have happened 10 years ago. You should just be over the danger. But because of this, this system, it forces the body to respond to the danger again. And eventually the individual the person literally cannot stop responding to perceived danger, false danger. They just think there's a danger when there isn't. And even when the actual danger has long passed. And this continual, uncontrolled threat response just runs amok. And that results in the illness known as PTSD. And everything happens so fast that you cannot cognitively or even consciously stop it unless you get special treatment with medical professionals to rewire the brain. Plus, myelin insulates the neurological pathways. They get myelinated. So what happens is PTSD is a traumatic stress response. It keeps happening over and over again because the pathways get myelinated, and then it could be a default response for the rest of someone's life. And there's also something known as the slow response, which is the executive function when you think about things, versus the fast response. And again, with PTSD, it's the fast response, right? It bypasses the cortex. It's directly connected to the hypothalamus, directly connected to the brainstem. Everything's done in milliseconds. In danger, the brain defaults to the fast track, and you can't reason out of it. It's just not rational at all. And there's actually a summary of the progression from the acute traumatic response to PTSD. And it gets a little detailed, perhaps we could discuss that in another video. I don't want this video to be too overly detailed. But how is a PTSD as valuable as a TBI? Well, first of all, a lawyer should not rely on medical personnel to evaluate whether or not someone has a TBI or a PTSD. Because, an emergency room or even an urgent care, any kind of medical personnel, usually what they do is they want to move patients from the entrance to the exit, right? They have strict criteria. That's why it's called treated and released. They want to treat the patient and then they want to get the patient out. And they're assuming that if the patient really has, let's say, PTSD or a TBI, that they'll go and they'll follow up with a neurologist and they'll get all these, beautiful, excellent levels of care, which may be unrealistic. It may be untrue. In fact, it probably is untrue, but that's the way the system is designed. So to fix that as an attorney, what you have to do is be familiar with the medical symptoms and do your own screening process. And it's really important for an attorney to work with a mentor, a doctor who's a mentor in the medical field, and work hand in hand. But at intake, let's say a new case comes in, right? And they say, I have, some kind of memory loss. I have some kind of symptoms of perhaps PTSD or TBI. What do you do at intakes? What questions do you ask to see if there is PTSD? Well, the first category is, what emotional effect has this had on you? It's not really a question, but it's rather an entire category, right? And you want to ask them, well, tell me what happened in the past. You want to listen carefully to their speech pattern. Do they speed up? Do they stop? Are there gaps in their pattern? Do they disconnect? Have you ever thought of the event, right? It's a car crash or whatever the event was. Have you ever thought of it since then? When you think of it, what do you do? And what happens to you when you think of it? Like, for example, does it come up in your sleep? Do you dream about it? Do you have nightmares? Do you have unconscious thoughts about it? Is it triggered by sounds or smells? These triggers cannot be stopped. They just keep coming. So that's very important. Have you ever been back to the location of incident? For example, if it's a car crash, have you been back to the intersection? Well, a person with an emotional condition try to avoid the location of incident, because if they get close to it, they start to shake. They have the physical response. And so this lays the groundwork for PTSD diagnosis. Remember, only a trained medical professional will be able to diagnose PTSD, but what an attorney can do is it can be like a spotter. They could see, hey, wait a minute, I identify an issue. This may be someone that I should send to a medical professional. So that's what you do as an attorney. You kind of like find the issue as opposed to diagnosing yourself. But it's very, very important. And also with PTSD, you see a lot of risk-taking behavior. For example, combat vets, when they come back, because they have that thrill of being in combat, of shooting, of being, shot at. What they do is maybe they come home, they buy the fastest motorcycle. They need that thrill again. Some people will self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. Hypervigilance is another behavioral and emotional trait people with PTSD get. They're like hypervigilant. They're always looking out for possible danger, even when the danger isn't there. And, PTSD can happen with both men and women, especially with instances of sexual abuse. It can happen with kids who have been shamed in school or even on social media. For example, they have a fight and then the school doesn't protect a student. And then in the fight, someone gets beat up and then all the rest of the kids shame them. They laugh at them that they got beat up. So yeah, it leads to moodiness, irritability. People will get angry much faster than they used to. And they'll get angry about things that normal people don't get angry about. They'll get depressed, they'll get detached from normal social conditions, and they'll be numb to feelings that, most people would be happy about, right? Like happy feelings that make you excited. They'll be numb to those, but they'll be angry more than normal. And so by doing just like a 10, 15, maybe 30-minute interview, the lawyer could be that spotter and find the issue. And remember, there's no cure for PTSD. All anyone could do is manage the symptoms. But I would say PTSD is as valuable as a traumatic brain injury. It really comes down to the people who decide value, the appraisers, and that's the jury. So it really is important to pick the right jury, to do a proper voir dire if you have a trial, and to explain all of this to the jury so they could properly evaluate and appraise, put a number on the value of PTSD. So how do you do that? Well, you do it by doing your homework, right? You have to speak to the patient, speak to his family, friends, people that knew them before and after the injury. And some people would even say PTSD is worth more or equal to a mTBI, a mild traumatic brain injury. Because with an mTBI, the deficits shown And the deficits are shown by before and after, right? What was your life like before, and what was your life like after the, let's say, car crash that caused the mild traumatic brain injury? And sometimes the jurors just decide that it doesn't appear to be all that much, because let's say there's no cognitive deficit. Let's say the only thing is you appear to be a little bit more anxious, or you don't sleep as much, you don't sleep as well. So people don't really identify, like jurors are just people, right, from the community, just like 6 people here in New York. In other states, it might be 12 people from the community, but they might not really identify and relate to that because they've never had a TBI. They've never had anyone in their family with a TBI. But with PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder, all jurors have had struggles, emotional issues, right, personal experiences, maybe some things they're not even conscious of. So that is very relatable. And for that, it's very important to do the proper voir dire in jury selection, because a lot of lawyers will say your case is won or lost in jury selection. And so, yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of results. Like one of the CLEs I did, there was a case with a 12-year-old boy, no physical injury, just PTSD. Friends, family, teachers testified, and the lawyer actually used the defense expert to become his expert to prove that PTSD is a TBI by citing some of the same literature and studies that I mentioned earlier. And so it was a $5 million verdict. No physical injury whatsoever. So you can show that PTSD is a serious injury. It's really only worth as much as you believe in it and as much as you can convince using the medicine and the lay witnesses, as much as you can convince the jurors, right? Because ultimately they're the ones who are deciding the case. And it's important to understand that PTSD has to have its own story. Every individual is a little bit different with their PTSD. It has its own personality, its own origin struggle, where it shows up, how it acts, will it ever leave? And so that is something that's very important. It's almost like, you know, if you're in a grocery store and you have a small child and the child just throws a tantrum. You never know when it's going to happen. If it's going to happen, you cannot control it. And that's why a lot of people turn to drugs or alcohol to manage the PTSD. And one of the big defense things is what they'll say is, look, you're having the PTSD, you're having the TBI and the PTSD because you're choosing to self-medicate, right? Because you're taking drugs, because you're drinking. It's not a symptom of the TBI or the PTSD, but it's because you're doing, let's say, drugs. Maybe you're doing, like some people even doing like meth or other dangerous drugs. And the response to that is just to tell them to prove it, right? Because as a plaintiff, you have the burden of proof to prove your case, but the defense can't just call your plaintiff names and just make these false accusations without proof. They have to actually prove it. Like, what caused the person to start seeking out drugs? What did you do to them to get them to start doing the self-destructive behavior? Perhaps it was a traumatic event and the PTSD that led them to the alcohol and the drugs, which is a known consequence, right? That's a known thing that everyone does who has PTSD. So this, and if the person was not doing any of the self-destructive behavior before, then that is really powerful as well. And the other thing is that, you have to make the defendants take responsibility, because if they are the ones, let's say, who hit a pedestrian in a crosswalk and the pedestrian has PTSD now, they can't now say, well, we damaged the brain to the point that it hurts and it doesn't work like it used to before. But we want a discount. It's not worth anything. But you're the one who did it, so you don't get a discount. If you're the one who did it, then it's your choice, the defendant's choice that did it. So that's very important. You don't get to take something away from someone without their permission and then ask for a discount later or criticize to say, hey, they could have been a better patient. So that's a good way to respond to the defenses. Another issue is like what I call sometimes people care versus money care. You have to compare and contrast how the defense, how much money did they spend on convincing the jury and convincing the court that the plaintiff isn't hurt versus how much did they spend on safety? How much did they spend on helping the patient's brain get better? Almost nothing, right? They never spend anything on safety because they don't take responsibility. They don't spend anything on helping the patient get better, but they'll spend inordinate amounts, right? Hire all these experts, doctors, lawyers, just to say that the person is not hurt. So that's something that the jurors can get mad at. Yeah, so basically the key is to bring to the listener's consciousness the fact that the defendant has no proof. They're just calling our client names, and that you can't do that. And what they're trying to do is they know that people will be judgmental if they bring up human frailties and weaknesses. And, you know, a society really is defined by how they treat the least among them, the weakest among them. So those are the ones that have the greatest advancements. So that's the way that you could deal with that. And so what doctors are the most helpful with PTSD? Well, probably social workers, teachers at school, resources from work environments, could be medical doctors as well as neuroradiologists, neurologists, neuropsychologists. They don't have to have fancy degrees, but they do have to have credibility with a jury and be independent, like no skin in the game. And so, yeah, I think it's important to tell a story using both the medicine as well as the human aspect of it, so that you get an emotional response from the jurors, because it really is an emotional injury. And there's also been known to be what's known as secondary sequelae, other injuries from the PTSD, such as cardiovascular injuries, sleep disorders, cognitive dysfunctions, and there have been collateral sequelae, such as sleep issues, arrhythmia, syncope, strokes, pulmonary hypertension, heart failure, and then there have been psychosocial sequelae, such as unemployment, homelessness, substance abuse, especially opioids, assault, suicide. So yeah, it's a very, very serious injury, depending on, you know, how it's treated. And then there's a lot more specifics here that I won't get into in this video, things about very, very specific topics. But yeah, but I would say that that's the important thing, to get the right treatment, to diagnose it, get the right treatment, get the right level of care, and then go from there. You know, that's the most important thing. And then also, as a lawyer, speak to everyone, that do your homework, basically. Speak to the client, speak to their family, their friends, people that knew them before, people that know them afterwards. Definitely get into their school, into their work, all of their different environments, so you could really do a deep dive and send them to the right doctors. There are certain doctors that specialize in PTSD treatment. So I hope this has been helpful. Let us know what questions you have. Drop us a comment, and we will talk to you very soon. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.